The small courtroom in Willow Creek buzzed with an undercurrent of anticipation, the kind that simmered in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business. The wooden benches, polished to a dull sheen from years of restless spectators, were half filled with locals who had come to witness the latest chapter in a saga that had gripped the community for weeks. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and nervous sweat, the ceiling fans lazily stirring the stale atmosphere. At the center of it all sat Judge Harold Grayson, a man whose stern demeanor and neatly pressed robes commanded respect, though his reputation for quick judgments often preceded him. His graying hair was combed back meticulously, and his sharp blue eyes scanned the room with the confidence of someone who had presided over countless disputes, from petty theft to heated property battles. Today's case, however, was no ordinary squabble. It was the culmination of a neighborhood feud that had spiraled into a legal showdown, one that had the entire town whispering behind closed doors. The plaintiff, Karen Whitaker, was a woman whose name had become synonymous with unrelenting persistence. Her perfectly coiffed blonde hair and tailored blazer gave her the appearance of a suburban queen, but her sharp tongue and penchant for control had earned her a less flattering reputation. Karen lived in the gated community of Willow Heights, a pristine enclave of manicured lawns and imposing homes where the Homeowners Association ruled with an iron fist. She was the HOA president, a role she wielded like a scepter, enforcing rules with a zeal that bordered on obsession. Her latest target was a man named Marcus Tate, a newcomer to Willow Heights whose very presence seemed to unsettle the carefully curated order of the neighborhood. Marcus was a black man in his early 40s, with a quiet demeanor and an unassuming wardrobe of simple button-downs and slacks. He had moved into a modest but well-maintained home on Maple Drive 6 months prior, and almost immediately Karen had taken issue with him. The trouble began with a seemingly trivial matter, Marcus's mailbox. It was a sleek, modern design, painted a deep navy blue, which clashed with the HOA strict guideline that all mailboxes be a uniform shade of forest green. Karen had sent him a polite but firm letter demanding compliance. When Marcus ignored the request, citing that he had received no such rule in the HOA handbook, the situation escalated. Letters turned into fines, fines turned into warnings, and warnings turned into a full-blown campaign to force Marcus out of the neighborhood. Karen claimed his noncompliance was a threat to property values, a rallying cry that resonated with some of the more conservative residents. Whispers circulated that Marcus didn't fit in Willow Heights, that his refusal to conform was a sign of deeper issues. Some speculated he was involved in shady dealings, pointing to his late-night arrivals and the occasional black SUV parked in his driveway. Others simply didn't like that he kept to himself, offering little more than a nod to neighbors who expected warm introductions and invitations to barbecues. The courtroom drama was the result of Karen's latest move, a lawsuit against Marcus for violating multiple HOA covenants, not just the mailbox, but also alleged infractions like parking his car too close to the curb and failing to trim his hedges to the precise height specified in the bylaws. She sought a court order to compel compliance and, more crucially, to evict Marcus from Willow Heights entirely. The case had drawn attention because it wasn't just about a mailbox or hedges. It was about power, control, and the unspoken tensions that simmered beneath the surface of a community obsessed with appearances. Karen sat at the plaintiff's table, her posture rigid, her lips pursed in a thin line of determination. Her attorney, a wiry man named Gerald Finch, shuffled papers with an air of selfish-rudeness, confident that the case was a slam dunk. Marcus, on the other hand, sat alone at the defendant's table. He had no attorney, a fact that raised eyebrows among the spectators. His dark suit was neatly pressed, but there was a simplicity to his appearance that contrasted sharply with the polished aggression of Karen and her legal team. His hands rested calmly on the table, his expression unreadable, though his dark eyes seemed to take in every detail of the room. To the casual observer, he appeared out of his depth, a man facing the full weight of the HOA resources without so much as a lawyer to speak for him. Judge Grayson, too, seemed to share this impression. As he called the court to order, his gaze lingered on Marcus with a mix of curiosity and skepticism, as if wondering why this man hadn't simply settled or hired representation. The judge's lips twitched slightly, a faint smirk that suggested he expected this case to be a straightforward affair. The proceedings began with Gerald Finch presenting Karen's case. He painted a vivid picture of Willow Heights as a paragon of order and prestige, a neighborhood where rules were not just guidelines, but the very foundation of community harmony. He described Marcus as a disruptor, a man who flouted regulations with blatant disregard, threatening the delicate balance that residents like Karen worked tirelessly to maintain. He produced photographs of the offending mailbox, the car parked an inch too close to the curb, and the hedges that were a quarter-inch too tall. Each piece of evidence was presented with theatrical flourish, as if these minor infractions were crimes against civilization itself. Karen nodded along, her expression one of righteous indignation, occasionally dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, as if the stress of Marcus's rebellion had taken a personal toll. The spectators leaned forward, some nodding in agreement, others whispering about the audacity of this newcomer who dared to challenge the HOA authority. Willow Heights was a place where conformity was a badge of honor, and Karen's crusade resonated with those who saw her as a defender of their way of life. The judge, too, seemed swayed by the presentation. His pen moved swiftly across his notepad, and he occasionally glanced at Marcus with a raised eyebrow, as if expecting the man to crumble under the weight of the evidence. But Marcus remained still, his hands clasped, his face betraying no hint of anxiety. If anything, there was a quiet confidence in his posture, a subtle strength that went unnoticed by most in the room. When it was Marcus's turn to respond, the courtroom fell silent. Judge Grayson leaned back in his chair, his expression one of mild amusement, as if anticipating a feeble defense from a man who clearly didn't understand the gravity of his situation. Marcus rose slowly, his movements deliberate, and approached the podium. He carried no briefcase, no stack of papers, just a small leather wallet that he placed on the table before him. The judge's smirk widened slightly, and a ripple of soft laughter spread through the spectators. This was it, they thought, the moment when Marcus would fumble, perhaps plead ignorance or beg for leniency. Karen's lips curled into a satisfied smile, and Gerald Finch leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, ready to watch the defendant's inevitable defeat. But Marcus didn't speak immediately. Instead, he reached into his wallet and withdrew a small, metallic object that glinted under the courtroom's fluorescent lights. He held it up, letting it catch the light, and the room's atmosphere shifted in an instant. The object was a badge, its surface embossed with the unmistakable seal of the United States Secret Service. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom, the sound sharp and involuntary. Judge Grayson's smirk vanished, his eyes widening as he leaned forward, his pen frozen mid-air. Karen's smile faltered, her tissue dropping to the table as her hands trembled. Gerald Finch, his confident posture dissolved into a rigid, almost panicked stillness. The spectators, who moments ago had been chuckling, now sat in stunned silence, their eyes darting between Marcus and the badge that had just turned their assumptions upside down. Marcus placed the badge on the podium, its presence a silent rebuke to the room's earlier mockery. He didn't need to say a word. The badge spoke for him, its authority undeniable. The courtroom, once alive with whispers and laughter, was now a vacuum of shock and uncertainty. Judge Grayson cleared his throat, his face reddening as he struggled to regain his composure. He adjusted his glasses, peering at the badge as if to confirm its authenticity, though the weight of its significance was already sinking in. Marcus stood tall, his gaze steady, his silence more powerful than any argument Gerald Finch had presented. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would come next, as the implications of Marcus's identity began to ripple through the minds of everyone present. The chapter ends here, with the courtroom frozen in a moment of revelation. The balance of power shifted in an instant. What did Marcus's badge mean for the case, for Karen's crusade, for the entire community of Willow Heights? The answers would come, but not yet. For now, the shock of the moment lingered, a cliffhanger that left the spectators and the town reeling. The courtroom in Willow Creek remained suspended in a state of stunned silence, the air heavy with the weight of Marcus Tate's revelation. The United States Secret Service badge gleamed on the podium, its metallic surface catching the fluorescent lights like a beacon of authority that no one in the room could ignore. Judge Harold Grayson, whose earlier smirk had betrayed his underestimation of the man before him, now sat rigid, his hands gripping the arms of his chair as if to steady himself against the tide of uncertainty that had flooded the proceedings. Karen Whitaker, the indomitable HOA president, was a portrait of unraveling composure, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the edge of the plaintiff's table as her eyes remained fixed on the badge. Her attorney, Gerald Finch, shuffled papers aimlessly, his earlier confidence replaced by a nervous energy that radiated from his fidgeting hands. The spectators, a mix of Willow Heights residents and curious townsfolk, exchanged wide-eyed glances, their whispers stifled by the gravity of what they had just witnessed. Marcus Tate, the quiet newcomer they had dismissed as an outsider, was no ordinary defendant. He was something far more significant, and the implications of his identity hung over the courtroom like a storm cloud ready to burst. Marcus stood at the podium, his posture calm but commanding, his dark eyes scanning the room with a quiet intensity that seemed to pierce through the collective shock. He hadn't spoken a word since revealing the badge, yet his silence was deafening, a calculated pause that allowed the weight of his authority to settle into every corner of the room. The badge wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a symbol of power, of secrets, of a life that none in Willow Heights could have anticipated. The residents had painted him as a troublemaker, a man who defied their sacred HOA rules with his navy blue mailbox and untrimmed hedges. Now they were forced to confront the possibility that Marcus was not only untouchable, but also someone whose presence in their community carried a significance they couldn't yet grasp. Judge Grayson cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the oppressive silence, and leaned forward, his voice strained as he addressed Marcus. The judge's tone, once laced with condescension, now carried a cautious respect, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. He asked Marcus to state his defense, a formality that felt almost unnecessary given the badge's unspoken authority. Marcus's response was measured, his movements deliberate as he picked up the badge and placed it back in his wallet, a gesture that seemed to signal he was ready to proceed on his own terms. He began to outline his defense, not with the flustered desperation the room had expected, but with a calm precision that suggested he was no stranger to high-stakes situations. He explained that he had purchased the home on Maple Drive legally, that he had reviewed the HOA bylaws and found no explicit violation in his actions, and that the accusations against him were based on selective enforcement and personal bias. His words were not those of a man pleading for mercy, but of someone who knew the law and his place within it. The spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their earlier certainty crumbling. Karen's campaign against Marcus had been fueled by whispers and assumptions, by the unspoken discomfort some residents felt about a black man living in their pristine enclave. Now, those assumptions were being dismantled, piece by piece, as Marcus's credentials cast a new light on his presence. The black SUV that had sparked rumors of shady dealings, likely a government vehicle tied to his work with the Secret Service, his late night arrivals, perhaps the result of assignments that required discretion and irregular hours. The navy, blue mailbox, the hedges, the car parked an inch too close to the curb. These were no longer symbols of rebellion, but trivialities in the face of Marcus's true identity. The room buzzed with a new kind of energy, one of curiosity and unease, as the residents grappled with the realization that they had misjudged the man they sought to expel. Karen, however, was not ready to concede. Her face flushed with a mix of anger and humiliation. She leaned toward Gerald Finch, whispering urgently as Marcus continued his defense. Gerald, his composure fraying, rose to object, arguing that Marcus's badge, while impressive, was irrelevant to the HOA violations. The objection was weak, a desperate attempt to regain control of a narrative that was slipping through their fingers. Judge Grayson overruled it almost immediately, his tone sharper now, as if he, too, was reevaluating his role in this unfolding drama. The judge's earlier amusement had been replaced by a cautious professionalism, his eyes darting between Marcus and the badge's empty spot on the podium. It was clear that the dynamics of the courtroom had shifted irrevocably, and Karen's cyan-clad case was beginning to show cracks. As Marcus concluded his defense, he introduced a new piece of evidence, a series of documents he had obtained through public records requests. These weren't the haphazard notes of a desperate defendant, but meticulously gathered records that painted a damning picture of the Willow Heights HOA. The documents revealed a pattern of selective enforcement, showing that other residents had committed similar or worse violations on approved paint colors, oversized lawn decorations, even unregistered vehicles, without facing the same scrutiny as Marcus. The records also hinted at Karen's personal vendetta, including emails where she referred to Marcus as that man and urged board members to take action to protect the neighborhood's character. The spectators gasped as Marcus projected these emails onto a small screen he had set up, each word a blow to Karen's credibility. The emails weren't just complaints, they were laced with a tone that bordered on prejudice, a fact that hung heavily in the room. Karen's face drained of color, her hands trembling as she clutched her tissue, now crumpled into a tight ball. Gerald Finch scrambled to counter the evidence, arguing that the emails were taken out of context, but his voice lacked conviction. The spectators, once firmly in Karen's corner, began to whisper among themselves, their loyalty wavering as the reality of her actions came into focus. Willow Heights had prided itself on its unity, its image as a perfect community, but Marcus's evidence exposed the underbelly of that perfection, a culture of exclusion, of control, of judgment passed under the guise of rules. The judge, too, seemed affected, his brow furrowed as he reviewed the documents Marcus had submitted. The case was no longer about a mailbox or hedges. It was about fairness, about power, about the kind of community Willow Heights wanted to be. As the day's proceedings drew to a close, Judge Grayson announced a recess, stating that he needed time to review the new evidence before moving forward. The courtroom erupted into murmurs as the spectators filed out, their conversations a mix of shock, intrigue, and speculation. Karen remained at the plaintiff's table, her head bowed, her earlier confidence replaced by a visible fragility. Gerald Finch packed his briefcase with hurried movements, avoiding eye contact with his client. Marcus, meanwhile, gathered his documents with the same calm precision he had displayed throughout, his wallet tucked back into his pocket, the badge hidden but its impact lingering. The residents of Willow Heights left the courthouse in a daze, their perceptions of Marcus and of themselves forever altered. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps, where small groups of spectators lingered, dissecting the day's events. The revelation of Marcus's Secret Service badge had been a bombshell, but it was his evidence of the HOA misconduct that promised to reshape the case. Questions swirled. How would Karen respond? Could she salvage her reputation, her leadership, her crusade? And what did Marcus's role in the Secret Service mean for his life in Willow Heights? The answers were still out of reach, but one thing was certain: the battle was far from over. The courtroom would reconvene, and with it, the next chapter of this unfolding drama would begin, carrying the weight of a community forced to confront its own flaws. The Willow Creek Courthouse was a cauldron of tension as the final day of the trial dawned. The morning light filtering through the tall windows to cast a muted glow over the packed courtroom. The wooden benches, once half empty, were now filled to capacity, with residents of Willow Heights and curious onlookers from neighboring towns cramming shoulder to shoulder, drawn by the explosive revelations of the previous session. The air buzzed with anticipation, the kind that precedes a storm, as whispers of Marcus Tate's U.S. Secret Service badge and the damning evidence against the HOA circulated like wildfire. Judge Harold Grayson took his seat at the bench, his face a mask of stern neutrality, though the faint creases around his eyes betrayed the weight of the decision he was about to render. His robes hung heavier today, as if the gravity of the case had settled into the fabric itself. The spectators' eyes darted between the plaintiff's table, where Karen Whitaker sat with a brutal composure, and the defendant's table, where Marcus Tate stood alone, his calm presence a stark contrast to the chaos he had unleashed. Karen Whitaker, once the unchallenged queen of Willow Heights, was a shadow of her former self. Her blonde hair, still impeccably styled, seemed to lack its usual luster, and her tailored blazer hung loosely on her frame, as if she had shrunk beneath the scrutiny of the past days. Her attorney, Gerald Finch, sat beside her, his movements jerky, his briefcase overflowing with papers that no longer held the promise of victory. The emails Marcus had presented, those scathing, thinly veiled attacks on his character, had stripped away Karen's veneer of righteousness, exposing her as a woman driven not by principle but by prejudice. The spectators, many of whom had once cheered her crusade, now watched her with a mix of pity and disapproval. The HOA iron grip on Willow Heights, once a source of pride, was now a symbol of division, and Karen bore the brunt of that shift. Her hands fidgeted with a pen, her knuckles white, as she braced for the final reckoning. Marcus, by contrast, exuded a quiet strength that seemed to anchor the room. His dark suit was as unassuming as ever, but the memory of his Secret Service badge lingered in the minds of everyone present, a silent testament to his authority. He carried no briefcase, no stack of papers, just the same small leather wallet that had turned the tide of the trial. His face was unreadable, his eyes steady as they met Judge Grayson's gaze, betraying no hint of the pressure that must have weighed on him. The residents of Willow Heights had underestimated him, dismissed him as an outsider who didn't belong. But Marcus had proven himself to be something far greater, a man whose life extended beyond the manicured lawns and petty disputes of their gated community. His presence in the courtroom was a reminder that the world was bigger than Willow Heights, and that their rules, their judgments, were not as absolute as they had believed. Judge Grayson began the session by addressing the evidence presented in the previous hearing. His voice was measured, but there was an undercurrent of gravity that silenced the room. He acknowledged Marcus's documents, which had exposed the HOA selective enforcement and Karen's personal vendetta. The emails, in particular, had struck a chord, their language revealing a bias that could not be ignored. The judge noted that the HOA bylaws, while strict, were not uniformly applied, and that Marcus's alleged violations, his navy blue mailbox, his slightly overgrown hedges, his car parked an inch too close to the curb, were minor compared to the infractions overlooked in other homes. The spectators shifted uncomfortably, some glancing at neighbors they knew had bent the rules without consequence. The judge's words were a mirror held up to Willow Heights, forcing the community to confront its own hypocrisy. As the judge continued, he turned his attention to Marcus's credentials. The Secret Service badge, while not directly relevant to the HOA violations, had shifted the courtroom's dynamics, lending Marcus an authority that could not be dismissed. The judge did not delve into Marcus's professional life. Such details were beyond the scope of the case, but the badge's presence had clearly influenced his perspective. It was a reminder that Marcus was not just a resident, but a man with responsibilities that extended far beyond the neighborhood's petty disputes. The judge's tone softened slightly as he addressed Marcus, a subtle acknowledgement of the respect he now commanded. The spectators, too, seemed to see Marcus in a new light, their earlier whispers of suspicion replaced by curiosity about the man they had so quickly judged. Karen's defense, presented by Gerald Finch, was a desperate attempt to salvage her case. Gerald argued that the HOA rules were essential to maintaining property values, that Marcus's defiance set a dangerous precedent, and that the emails were merely expressions of frustration, not evidence of malice. But his arguments fell flat, lacking the conviction that had once carried them. The spectators were no longer swayed by talk of property values or community standards. They were grappling with the realization that their HOA, under Karen's leadership, had targeted Marcus unfairly. Gerald's voice grew strained as he spoke, his gestures more erratic, as if he sensed the case slipping away. Karen sat silently, her eyes fixed on the table, her earlier defiance replaced by a quiet resignation. The courtroom, once her domain, now felt like a stage where her downfall was being scripted. When Marcus was given the opportunity to respond, he did so with the same calm precision that had defined his presence throughout the trial. He reiterated that his actions had not violated any enforceable rule, that the HOA accusations were rooted in bias rather than fact, and that the community deserved better than leadership that thrived on division. He spoke not as a victim, but as a man who understood the weight of his words, each one chosen carefully to expose the flaws in Willow Heights' system. His evidence had already done much of the work, but his final statement was a call for accountability, a challenge to the residents to rethink the values they held dear. The spectators listened in rapt silence, some nodding slowly, others staring at their hands, as if confronting their own complicity in the HOA actions. Judge Grayson concluded the proceedings by delivering his ruling. He dismissed the lawsuit against Marcus, stating that the HOA had failed to provide sufficient evidence of enforceable violations. He went further, issuing a stern rebuke to the HOA for its selective enforcement and warning that such practices could not continue unchecked. The judge stopped short of addressing Karen's emails directly, but his tone made it clear that her leadership had been called into question. The ruling was a victory for Marcus, but it was also a turning point for Willow Heights, a community now forced to reckon with its own failings. The spectators erupted into murmurs as the gavel fell, some expressing relief, others disbelief as they processed the outcome. Karen left the courtroom without a word, her head bowed, her steps unsteady as she navigated the crowd. Gerald Finch followed, his briefcase clutched tightly, his face a mask of defeat. The residents of Willow Heights spilled out onto the courthouse steps, their conversations a mix of shock, guilt, and speculation about what would come next. Marcus lingered briefly, shaking hands with a few spectators who approached him with newfound respect. He declined to speak to the local reporters who had gathered, their cameras flashing as they tried to capture the man who had upended their town's narrative. As he walked away, his wallet tucked into his pocket, the weight of his badge seemed to linger in the air, a symbol of a truth that Willow Heights could no longer ignore. In the days that followed, Willow Heights was a community in flux. Karen resigned from her position as HOA president, citing personal reasons, though the truth was evident to all. The HOA board faced pressure to reform, with residents calling for transparency and fairness in how rules were enforced. Marcus continued to live on Maple Drive, his navy blue mailbox untouched, his hedges allowed to grow just a fraction beyond regulation. The black SUV still appeared in his driveway from time to time, a reminder of the life he led beyond the neighborhood's borders. The residents, once quick to judge, now greeted him with cautious nods, some even offering apologies for their earlier assumptions. The trial had been more than a legal battle. It had been a mirror held up to a community that prided itself on perfection, but had been forced to confront its flaws. The story of Marcus Tate and the Willow Heights HOA became a local legend, retold at barbecues and book clubs, a cautionary tale about the dangers of judgment and the power of truth. For Marcus, life went on, his quiet strength unchanged, his badge a private reminder of the authority he carried. Willow Heights would never be the same, its residents forever altered by the man who had walked into their courtroom and turned their world upside down.
If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with others so they can learn something from it too.